As a kingdom in the ancient Near East, Israel had its own combat myths and associated cultic traditions. In the Hebrew version, Yahweh is the storm god warrior who subdues the sea and its associate dragon. There is even evidence that, like Baal, he too battled death. To these myths, their contexts, and the various uses to which they were put diachronically, I now turn. For the history of Yahwism, from ancient Israelite cult to Second Temple Judaism and beyond, the importance of the combat myth and the depiction of Yahweh as divine warrior can hardly be overstated. Indeed, Theodore Hebert well summarizes this enduring significance when he writes, "The understanding of God as a warrior is grounded in the origins of biblical religion. The image of the divine warrior dominates the oldest Israelite poetry, remains a frequent characterization of God throughout the biblical period, and gains a new prominence in the apocalyptic literature of both Jewish and Christian communities." Understanding the evolution of this conception from ancient myth to crucial apocalyptic framework is necessary for an appreciation of its ultimate role in the Gospels. So far, we have identified and analyzed various ancient Near Eastern combat myths by means of their thematic, motivic, and structural similarity. However, considerations of narrative progression become appreciably more difficult as we move into the Hebrew material since, as Andrew Angel has rightly noted, combat myth motifs are mostly found outside the context of strict narrative in Hebrew texts. A definition of the Hebrew combat myth by plot would be very difficult as the tradition uses images frequently, but it never places these images within a connected narrative. For example, the use of the Chaos Kampf image in Isaiah 17 can hardly be deemed a story, and the narrative is partial even where elements of story are present, e.g. Psalm 18:4-15. Indeed, the hints that we get of the Hebrew combat myth from the prophets and Psalms, for example, presume the story rather than tell it. For this reason, we must largely set aside our narrative schema in this chapter and instead rely primarily on the knowledge gleaned from the previous investigation of the combat myth genre, particularly its common themes and imagery. Later, we may return to the narrative schema when appropriate. Like Baal, Yahweh's chief enemy in the Hebrew combat myth is Yam, the raging sea. As a representative of chaos, sea must be defeated if order and fertility are to be secured in the cosmos. So we read, in scattered allusions from the Psalms and prophets, how the Israelite storm god battles the chaos enemy. One text reads, "Was your wrath against river, O Yahweh? Or your anger against river, or your rage against sea, when you drove your horses, your chariots to victory? You brandished your naked bow, sated were the arrows at your command. You trampled the sea with your horses, churning the mighty waters." Habakkuk 3:8-8-9a-15. Yahweh's conflict with Sea River is clearly analogous to Baal's enemy, Prince Sea Judge River, and both frequently noted in poetic parallelism. Here the trampling of the chaos enemy is attested, particularly reminiscent of how Marduk trampled the primordial sea after satting his lightning bolt arrows. Again, the roaring thunder that accompanies such lightning was understood as the storm god's mighty voice, and so Yahweh's chief battle weapon is often described simply as his voice. Roar, or most frequently, his rebuke. He rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering around him, his canopy thick clouds dark with water. Out of the brightness before him, there broke through his clouds hailstones and coals of fire. Yahweh also thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice. And he sent out his arrows and scattered them. He flashed forth lightnings and routed them. Then the channels of the waters were seen, and the foundations of the world were laid bare. At your rebuke, O Yahweh, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. Psalm 18:10-15. Here, in addition to the scattering of the raging sea waters, we find all anthropomorphic characterizations of the storm god's weapons, his lightning as arrows and his thunder as his rebuking voice. At his rebuke, the sea recoils and reveals the foundations of his creation. We find similar examples of Yahweh rebuking the chaos waters in Psalm 106:9, Isaiah 17:13 and 52, and Nahum 1:4. All relate the basic idea that Adhat rebuke, i.e., his mighty voice, the thunderous crash of his lightning, the sea, like a defeated enemy, hurries away and recedes to its rightful boundaries. Thus, order is established and the chaotic waters are contained. Another psalm draws all of these aspects together. You have laid the beams of your chambers on the waters. You make the cloud your chariot. You ride on the wings of the wind. You set the earth on its foundations, so that it shall never be shaken. You cover it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood upon the mountains. At your rebuke they flee. At the sound of your thunder they take to flight. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. Here, Yahweh is none other than the storm god in his cloud chariot, who tames the chaotic sea by his imposition of order. Indeed, as in other combat myths, his defeat of sea is intricately linked to cosmogony and creation. Ninurta created an irrigation system that stopped the waters from remaining upon the mountains. Marduk created heaven and earth out of sea's body. So Yahweh likewise keeps the waters from flooding the mountaintops and establishes an ordered, differentiated cosmos. Though most prevalent in the Psalms, for reasons considered below, references to this cosmic battle are found elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. In poetic terms, the author of Job makes use of Yahweh's contention with sea as he reflects on the unthinkable power of Yahweh and the futility of fighting against him, as sea had tried, but failed. If one wished to contend with him, one could not answer him once in 1,000. He is wise in heart and mighty in strength. Who has resisted him and succeeded? He who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of sea. Job 9:3-4-8. So we encounter the trampling of the sea and its connection with creation. Elsewhere, feeling that God is now contending against him, Job laments, Am I sea or dragon that you set guard over me? Why have you made me your target? Why have I become a burden to you? Job 7:12-20. This dragon to which Job refers is another enemy that Yahweh slays in his battles against the sea and the forces of chaos. Like Baal and the other storm gods, Yahweh does battle with the draconic helpers of chief chaos enemy. Thus the seven-headed sea dragon Leviathan from the Baal cycle reappears, with its name only slightly changed, as the many-headed sea dragon Leviathan. Yet God my King is from of old, working salvation in the earth. You divided sea by your might. You shattered the heads of dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for people in the wilderness. You cut openings for springs and torrents. You dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You established the luminaries and the sun. You have fixed all the bounds of the earth. You made summer and winter. Psalm 74:12-17. Here, the thematic concerns with both kingship and agricultural regularity are present, while with regard to motifs, we encounter the dismembering, dividing of the enemy sea. Indeed, the relationship of combat and cosmogony is particularly pronounced in the Hebrew tradition. After Yahweh crushed the heads of the dragons in primordial time, cf. Marduk and Baal crushing the heads of their draconic sea nemeses, he established the celestial objects, the boundaries of the earth, and the seasons. In perhaps the most fascinating similarity, however, Yahweh casts Leviathan's corpse in the desert to serve as food, just as Anat scattered the dragon yam in the desert, as well as the body of Mot, which was then eaten by birds. Thus we find the topos present in the Hebrew tradition as well, in which the defeated chaos monster is divided, its body serving as nourishment in a once barren place. An extensive description of Leviathan occupies Job 41. Here, Yahweh boasts to Job about his conquest of the sea monster. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook? Or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose? Or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you bind him for your maidens? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle. You will not do it again. Again we find the binding motif, as Yahweh himself boasts of ensnaring Leviathan, even specifically muzzling the dragon just as a knot muzzled Tunin. Elsewhere, Yahweh makes a similar boast. The Lord said, I stifled the serpent, muzzled the deep sea. Thus, similar to the Canaanite combat myths, Yahweh is said to have muzzled the dragon sea in the course of their battle. Other passages speak of the slaying of Rahab, whose name means the boisterous one, and thus, as John Day observes, an apt term for the personified raging sea. Rahab is certainly a chaos monster, and may in fact be simply another name for Leviathan. Psalm 89 links the taming of the sea, the crushing of Rahab, and creation. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahab like a carcass. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. The heavens are yours. The earth is also yours. The world and all that is in it, you have founded them. Psalm 89, 9-11. Similarly, Job meditates on the unrelenting anger of Yahweh in considering his own plight. God will not turn back his anger. The helpers of Rahab bowed beneath him. How then can I answer him, choosing my words with him? Job 9, 13-14. The thought again echoes the trampling motif. The helpers of the sea dragon Rahab lie in submission beneath Yahweh's feet as defeated enemies of the angry divine warrior. So Ninurta trampled Azag's helpers, Baal Yam's helpers, and Marduk Tiamet's. It is debatable whether explicit mention is made in the Hebrew Bible of any battle between Yahweh and death, Hebrew Mot. However, given Israel's traditional continuity with the Canaanite combat myths of Baal versus Sea River and the dragon, the existence of such a myth is quite plausible. Indeed, investigating such a hypothesis yields intriguing and suggestive evidence that such a myth did exist and even persisted for centuries in tradition despite its scarcity within canonized texts. Even in canonical Hebrew texts, however, the personification of death as a pernicious supernatural agent often transcends mere poetic expression. Indeed, the ancient Israelites clearly shared many mythic conceptions of death and the underworld with the Canaanite tradition. Sheol is even depicted as the swallower, whose consumption leads the dead into the pit. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive, and whole, like those who go down to the pit. Proverbs 1:12. Likewise, Isaiah 5:14. Therefore Sheol has enlarged its appetite, and opened its mouth beyond measure. The nobility of Jerusalem and her multitude go down, her throng and all who exult in her. Seeing that death was often understood as a supernatural agent with the same characteristics as the Canaanite god, some scholars have posited the existence of a combat myth between Yahweh and death, similar to the combat between Baal and death. Moving beyond the earliest poetic material, we see the combat myth employed throughout the Hebrew tradition in order to help frame specific political, historical situations. Indeed, various prophets liberally apply its imagery in attempts to heighten their political denouncements of rulers or enemies of Israel. So, for example, Isaiah 14:12-19 paints the king of Babylon as the cosmic adversary of the combat myth. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly on the heights of Zaphon. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities? Who would not let his prisoners go home? All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb, but you are cast out, away from your grave, like loathsome carrion, clothed with the dead, those pierced by the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit, like a corpse trampled underfoot. The shamed king is described with language steeped in mythological imagery, particularly Chaos Kampf imagery. He is presented as an attempted usurper, a challenger to Yahweh's throne in the same way that Yam and Mot challenged Baal's kingship, or Anzu, Enlil's, or Azag, Ninurta's. He would enthrone himself above Yahweh, on the traditional mountain of the Canaanite storm god, Zaphon. But instead, the king is defeated, hurled into the depths of the pit for his offense, and cast out from his grave to be eaten, perhaps reflecting the scattering motif. Certainly the combat myth trampling motif is employed here. Such is the fate of rebels who stand against the true cosmic king, Yahweh. The prophet Ezekiel employs very similar imagery in his prophecies of the imminent destruction which Yahweh will bring upon Israel's hubristic political enemies. So Yahweh summons Ezekiel to deliver his ominous message regarding the presumptuous kings. "Mortal, say to the prince of Tyre, thus says the Lord God, because your heart is proud, and you have said, I am a god. I sit in the seat of the gods in the heart of the seas. Yet you are but mortal, and no god, though you compare your mind with the mind of God. Therefore thus says the Lord God, because you compare your mind with the mind of a god, therefore I will bring strangers against you, the most terrible of the nations. They shall draw their swords against the beauty of your wisdom, and defile your splendor. They shall thrust you into the pit, and you shall die a violent death in the heart of the seas." Again, the cosmic language of the combat myth is employed in this political execration. As above, the ruler boasts of his enthronement as a god, while the references to the seas are ostensibly due to Tyre's geographical position as a city jutting out into the Mediterranean. They may also reflect a subtle equation of the prince with the oceanic chaos enemy, the monster in the midst of the sea. Like the combat myth adversaries, however, the would-be king is defeated by Yahweh and hurled into the pit. Equation of the king with the chaos monster is more explicit in the prophecies directed at the Egyptian pharaoh, the first of which comes a few verses later, presented in parallel form to the last denunciation. "Mortal, set your face against Pharaoh king of Egypt, and prophesy against him and against all Egypt. Speak and say, thus says the Lord God, I am against you, Pharaoh king of Egypt, the great dragon sprawling, in the midst of its channels and saying, my Nile is my own, I made it for myself. I will put hooks in your jaws and make the fish of your channels stick to your scales. I will draw you up from your channels with all the fish of your channels, sticking to your scales. I will fling you into the desert, you and all the fish of your channels. You shall fall in the open field and not be gathered and buried, to the animals of the earth and to the birds of the air. I have given you as food. The Pharaoh, like the king of Tyre, is guilty of unchecked hubris that challenges the supremacy of Yahweh. In his pride, he rebels against the true supreme deity, viewing himself as equal to the true Lord of creation. To this, Yahweh responds with the imagery of the combat myth. The Pharaoh is nothing more than the dragon that Yahweh triumphantly vanquished. He is no greater than Leviathan, the dragon in the sea, which Yahweh has slain and cast into the desert as food. The specific imagery of the combat myth is even more explicit in the denouncement of the Pharaoh in chapter 32. You consider yourself a lion among the nations, but you are like a dragon in the seas. You thrash about in your streams, trouble the water with your feet, and foul your streams. Thus says Yahweh God, in an assembly of many peoples, I will throw my net over you, and I will haul you up in my dragnet. I will throw you on the ground, and on the open field I will fling you, and will cause all the birds of the air to settle on you, and I will let the wild animals of the whole earth gorge themselves with you. I will strew your flesh on the mountains, and fill the valleys with your carcass. I will drench the land with your flowing blood. Up to the mountains, and the watercourses will be filled with you. When I blot you out, I will cover the heavens, and make their stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. The Pharaoh is the raging chaos monster, the dragon in the sea, whom Yahweh binds in his net, then divides and scatters, specifically over the mountains here, in remarkable similarity to the way Ninurta scatters and strews Azag over the mountains. All of this is done in the context of the storm theophany, as Yahweh covers the sky with his clouds, casting the scene of this chaos camp, as in others, into darkness. So is history interpreted in light of the combat myth. Israel's political enemies are the chaos monsters. Yahweh, acting through Israel generally, or her king specifically, is the mighty storm god who shall vanquish them. Until the turn of the 20th century and the achievements of comparative scholarly studies, Yahweh's battle with Leviathan and the raging sea remained largely opaque, a theme seemingly scattered haphazardly throughout the Psalms or the occasional prophetic passage in enigmatic references. Even today, the idea of Yahweh battling a giant sea dragon remains quite foreign to many. To suggest then that it once provided perhaps the most crucial mythic narrative for ancient Israelite religious practice may sound presumptuous to say the least. Nevertheless, there is ample reason to believe that it once lay at the heart of ancient Israelite religion. The insights of Paul Hansen are a helpful starting place for mitigating this discrepancy between the myth's apparent infrequency in biblical texts and its ancient cultic significance. According to Hansen, the Bible we have to today is not representative of the ancient cult of Yahweh as practiced at the Jerusalem temple, but rather reflects the minority views of certain prophetic circles which ultimately came to dominance after the exile. In Hansen's analysis, most of the prophets make relatively scant use of the Hebrew combat myth because their theological programs often stood in marked contrast to the royal theology of the Jerusalem court and cult, where the combat myth played a primary role. Thus, as liturgical texts from the cult, the Psalms provide us with insight into the nature of Israelite religion as practiced officially at the Jerusalem temple, and not the idiosyncratic views of the rival prophetic circles who generally diluted the mythological element. In the temple liturgy, writes Hansen, the ritual pattern of the conflict myth not only survived, but flourished. While this analysis of Hansen's might be enough to justify hypothesizing a particular prominence of the combat myth in popular religious practice, a necessary critique actually strengthens the argument. For Hansen argues that, contrary to the Chaos Camp-dominated cult, Yahwistic prophecy downplayed the mythological element and thus made scant use of the combat myth. Yet, as we have seen, and shall have ample opportunity to cite in further detail, the combat myth also flourished in prophetic circles. To be sure, its application in prophetic literature is less explicit, leading to a canon seemingly limited in Chaos Camp material. But this is not because the theological agenda of classical prophecy necessarily sought to downplay mythological material. Rather, the myth appears more diluted because the role it plays in prophetic literature is essentially different, as allusion and poetic reference, not strict presentation. Indeed, appreciating the dominance of the combat myth in the cult puts the prophetic material in context. The prophets assume this dominance in order to allude to it. Prophetic applications of the combat myth could be so subtle and elusive precisely because the myth was a given. In this sense, the seemingly diluted role of the myth in prophecy, far from being rooted in a fundamental tension between prophecy and orthodoxy, provides additional testimony to the myth's general popularity. With this important qualification, I return to Hansen's analysis of the official Jerusalem cult through its extant liturgical literature, the Psalms. Here we recall, Hansen says that the combat myth flourished, appearing frequently in a traditional form he calls the Divine Warrior Hymn. Remarkably, this form follows essentially the same progression as the combat myth schema we have been using. Thus, we often see 1. Threat. 2. Combat, victory over enemy. 3. Salvation of his people. 4. Manifestation of universal reign. 5. Victory shout. 6. Procession. 7. Shalom, return to fertility, new creation. In Hanson's terminology, the shalom represents the bounty and abundance consequent to Yahweh's victory over chaos. This is the agricultural rejuvenation which occurs because of the storm god's victory. The victory shout is the mighty voice battle cry of the divine warrior, while the manifestation of universal reign is analogous to the storm god's accession to kingship. These essential elements of the divine warrior hymn, he says, can be recognized in numerous psalms from various periods in the biblical Psalter. In his seminal works on the Psalter, Norwegian scholar Sigmund Mowinckel proposed a comprehensive interpretation for these texts. Given the psalms above, some of which comprise a subset of a distinct corpus dealing with Yahweh's kingship, the so-called Enthronement psalms, Mowinckel proposed a Sitz im Leben within the liturgy of a festival similar to the Babylonian Akitu festival or the Hittite Puruli festival. Such would have been, for the Israelites, the Feast of Tabernacles, also called the Feast of Booths and Sukkot, Israel's, originally New Year, harvest festival. It was at this time, as the agricultural year came to its end, that infertility, death, and disorder became most salient. The forces of chaos would assume their temporary dominance over the cosmos, and the Israelites looked to Yahweh's autumn rains, which would herald the return of fertility and life. In anticipation of such rejuvenation, and akin to other ancient Near Eastern New Year festivals, the festival celebrated, and in Eliadian terms enacted, Yahweh's defeat of the raging sea and its associate dragon, as well as his victory over death. Mowinckel argued that the central cultic event of this festival was the triumphal procession of Yahweh. In this procession, Yahweh, symbolized by his holy shrine, the Ark, was carried amidst singing and dancing to the temple, where the god was then ritually enthroned. Such processional rituals were, as we have seen, integral parts of other ancient Near Eastern New Year festivals, while it is possible that such a ritual enthronement had also existed at Ugarit. It is in the context of such an event that antiphonal processional hymns like Psalm 118 become clear. There are glad songs of victory in the tents of the righteous. The right hand of Yahweh does valiantly. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them. And give thanks to Yahweh. This is the gate of Yahweh. The righteous shall enter through it. Save us, we beseech you, O Yahweh. O Yahweh, we beseech you, give us success. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of Yahweh. We bless you from the house of Yahweh. Yahweh is God, and he has given us light. Bind the festal procession with branches up to the horns of the altar. The victory here alluded to is none other than Yahweh's triumph over the forces of chaos, celebrated as the procession makes its way to the inner gates of the temple. The tents were likely the ritual booths, and the branches those the Israelites cut in celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles. On the 15th day of this 7th month, and lasting 7 days, there shall be the festival of booths to Yahweh. On the first day you shall take the fruit of majestic trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook. And you shall rejoice before Yahweh your God for 7 days. Like the cultic icons of the gods at the other ancient New Year festivals, the Ark no doubt followed along a fixed processional road, a via sacra, on its way to the temple. These findings corroborate Mowinckel's assertion that the procession to the temple was understood as the ascent, or going up, to Jerusalem the temple, expressed in numerous psalms by the Hebrew verb Allah. So, for example, Psalm 24, which describes the cultic ascent to the gates of the temple and the following antiphonal exchange between celebrants, who bear the ark and petition entry from the gatekeeper. The earth is Yahweh's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. For he has founded it on the seas and established it on the rivers. Who shall ascend the mountain of Yahweh? And who shall stand in his holy place? Those who have clean hands and a pure heart, who do not lift up his soul to what is false, and do not swear deceitfully. They shall receive blessing from Yahweh and vindication from the God of his salvation. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of the glory may come in. Who is the King of the glory? Yahweh, strong and mighty, Yahweh, mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of the glory may come in. Who is this King of the glory? Yahweh of hosts, he is the King of the glory. Yahweh, who is proclaimed King at the New Year festival, is here represented by his ark, which has arrived at the temple gates and awaits cultic installation within the Holy of Holies. Leaving the house of Obed-Edom and traveling along this sacred way, Yahweh, as the ark, would then pass by the festive crowds excitedly clamoring for a glimpse at their deity. As noted in chapter 1, it was for this reason that the New Year procession was also the premier cultic epiphany of the god. Mawwinkle too argues this idea, noting that this was the time when Yahweh's shrine was presented to be seen before all of Israel, not hidden in the darkness of the Holy of Holies. The festival is then, he notes, a festival of the epiphany of Yahweh in the literal meaning of the word. Moreover, Mawwinkle argues, it is this appearance and enthronement day of Yahweh, which originally was called the Day of the Lord, the day of the feast of Yahweh. The day of the Lord is thus the same as the day of Yahweh's procession during Sukkot, the day of his epiphany. Finally, with much singing and dancing, the ark arrived at the temple, where it was reinstalled. This was understood as the God's enthronement. Indeed, Yahweh was imagined as enthroned between the cherubim of the ark in the temple. Like the triumphant announcement of Baal's kingship after his defeat of Yam, and that of Marduk before his defeat of Tiamat, Yahweh was then declared king after his defeat of sea, Leviathan, and death. So Enthronement Psalm 93, Yahweh has become king. He is robed in majesty. He has established the world. It shall never be moved. Your throne is established from of old. You are from everlasting. The rivers have lifted up, O Yahweh. The rivers have lifted up their voice. The rivers lift up their roaring. But mightier than the voices of many waters, than the waves of sea, is Yahweh on high. Your decrees are very sure. Holiness befits your house, O Yahweh, forevermore. Yahweh has become king after defeating the chaos forces and creating the world. The chaos waters, here the rivers and sea, and thus parallel to Baal's enemies, Judge River and Sea, opposed him, lifting up their thunderous voice in challenge to his power. But his mighty voice, thunder, is mightier than theirs, and so he rules assuredly and forevermore from his house, temple, as king. As Baal's voice was said to issue forth from his temple at the celebration of his enthronement, so is Yahweh's voice praised at his. These aspects are highlighted in Psalm 29, which many scholars maintain was originally a Canaanite psalm taken over wholesale, with the simple substitution of the name of Yahweh instead of Baal for the deity concerned. Regardless, it too presents Yahweh enthroned after vanquishing the chaos waters, emphasizing the power of his mighty voice. The voice of Yahweh is over the waters. The God of glory thunders, Yahweh over many waters. The voice of Yahweh is powerful. The voice of Yahweh is full of majesty. The voice of Yahweh breaks the cedars. Yahweh breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf, and Syrian like a young wild ox. The voice of Yahweh flashes forth flames of fire. The voice of Yahweh shakes the wilderness. Yahweh shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of Yahweh causes the oaks to whirl and strips the forest bare. And in his temple all say, Glory. Yahweh sits enthroned over the flood. Yahweh sits enthroned as king forever. May Yahweh give strength to his people. May Yahweh bless his people with peace. Drawing all of these strands together, From traditional motifs of the combat myth to reconstructions of its crucial festival, I close this examination of the combat myth in its original ancient Israelite cultic context with a look at Psalm 68. As a liturgical text of the New Year festival, it is dense with Chaos Kampf material and includes within its cluster of imagery the mighty voice, binding, trampling, and scattering motifs, traditional epithets and descriptions of the Canaanite storm god, allusions to the battles with sea and death, as well as vivid descriptions of the New Year procession to the temple. Let God rise up, let his enemies be scattered. Let those who hate him flee before him. Sing to God, sing praises to his name. Lift up a song to the rider of the clouds. His name is Yahweh. Be exultant before him. Rain in abundance, O God, you showered abroad. You restored your heritage when it languished. Your flock found a dwelling in it. In your goodness, O God, you provided for the needy. With mighty chariotry, twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands, Yahweh came from Sinai into the holy place. You ascended the high mount, leading captives in your train, and receiving gifts from people, even from those who rebel against Yahweh, God's abiding there. Our God is a God of salvation, and to the God Yahweh belongs escape from death. But God will shatter the heads of his enemies, the hairy crown of those who walk in their guilty ways. Yahweh said, I stifled the serpent. I muzzled the deep sea. Your solemn processions are seen, O God, the processions of my God, my King, into the sanctuary. The singers in front, the musicians last, between them girls playing tambourines. O you who are of Israel's fountain. There is Benjamin, the least of them, in the lead, the princes of Judah in a body, the princes of Zebulun, the princes of Naphtali. Summon your might, O God. Show your strength, O God, as you have done for us before. Rebuke the beasts that live among the reeds, the herd of bulls with the calves of the peoples. Trample underfoot those who lust after tribute. Scatter the peoples who delight in war. O rider in the heavens, the ancient heavens, listen, he sends out his voice, his mighty voice.